a very important and initiative that is taking place, and I look forward to much coming out of this gathering on today. I'm not only excited but also very nervous about this because this represents a new venture. Early in my work, I wanted to venture into some new areas and to do some new things in Black theology. And I got into dialogues on religion and science, but still was not quite happy because I wanted to even do a little bit more than that. I started a very ambitious project in 2016 and had invited about 47 scholars to contribute essays to a handbook of African American theology. Because some missed the deadlines, I wound up with 32 out of 47. So it represents, I think, a very good volume, but I was disappointed because some of the essays I really looked forward to being in the volume were not there. So when people get the book and they read it, and they might walk away thinking it's a good book, and yes, it is a good book, but there's some things that are missing. And if they don't know what's missing, I know what's missing. And one of those things that's missing is about this type of dialogue, the interreligious dialogue, which is something that we really need to have much more of in Black communities. So we've talked much about Christian-Muslim dialogue, and I have that represented within my own family context. But it's not just only Christian and Muslim. I have my very youngest sister converted to Buddhism. So it's a very expanding type of dialogue that we need to have about the religious choices that people are making today. On this topic, I want to sketch out just the historical background, the foundation that was laid in terms of Black theology, where Black theology started, where it is now, and why we do what we do in Black theology, what our principal focus is. Then looking at the way that the early Black theologians, principally James Cone, engaged Islam, but it was only around the figure of Malcolm X where he did not really get deep into the teachings of Islam as it relates to Christianity. And so his model, which became a paradigm for other scholars, and he mentored many students, he single-handedly, alone, produced or mentored and supervised over 40 PhD students in the history of his career at Union Theological Seminary. So he had a definite hand in shaping what this scholarship would be for that in the coming generations. But it's a polemical model that doesn't really get into the depth of Islam, but only deals with it on a very superficial or surface level. And I want to propose a theological model where we will be more engaging the text and the traditions and the ideas in the religion. And then lastly, suggest some type of emphases or some type of guides that we would use to give us a sense of how well we're doing and where we should focus as we're having a dialogue. In April of 1969, just a little over 50 years ago, James Cone published a book titled Black Theology and Black Power. And he was not alone in outlining this theology of Black power. Since 1966, several African American clergy, religion scholars, and theologians in a group called the National Committee of Negro Churchmen, and they later changed their name to the National Conference of Black Christians, were meeting on a regular basis to discuss, debate, and present essays on Black theology. They, more so Cone, were charting a new course in African American scholarship and theology. And James Cone's work would lay the foundation for the systematic construction of contemporary Black theology as we know it today. and especially, as I mentioned, with his appointment to Union Theological Seminary, where he mentored over 40 PhD students. And his students today are leading figures in the field of black theology and womanist theology. His students have operated principally within his paradigm, and they have not veered far from his theological method and the tone and the tenor of his rhetoric. In constructing his version of black theology, Cone drew inspiration from Martin Luther King Jr., a Christian pastor and leader in the civil rights movement, and Malcolm X, a Muslim leader and spokesman for the Black Power movement. The attraction to King was his Crozer Seminary education, his Boston University graduate degree in systematic theology, which enabled him to frame this civil rights movement within a Christian context. He was not only just a political figure, but he was trying to interpret this as something that Christian people should be involved in changing the world. The attraction that Cone had to Malcolm X was Malcolm's black consciousness and his black nationalism, an unwavering commitment to black liberation. Since the publication of James Cone's book, Black Theology and Black Power, African American theologians' interest and engagement with Islam has been mainly around black radicalism, rather than the basic beliefs and practices of Islam. My thesis is that whereas contemporary black theology's engagement with Islam has been limited for the most part to the intersection of Christianity and Islam in the practice of what's called black radicalism, there are recent trends and demographic shifts that demand a broader engagement that includes both matters of social justice and fundamental concepts and themes, and not only in Christianity and Islam, but also in other African American religions. Given the emphasis of this conference with Christian-Muslim dialogue, I just reserve comment on Christianity and Islam, that type of dialogue. So I want to cover, as I mentioned, some very broad strokes, just to give some context of this movement and black power, and also Cone's polemical model of the dialogue, and then some suggestions on some topics that we could explore and guidelines to follow in our dialogue. In Cone's writing, he intended to explain black theology to a wide black readership. And he says that when this movement began in the 1960s, it emerged out of three, he says, contexts. And one of them was the civil rights movement, the other was the Black Power movement, and the third context was out of a book published by Joseph Washington titled Black Religion, and subtitled The Negro and Christianity in the United States. We're all very familiar with the civil rights movement, what it was, and some important figures who were in that movement, and Martin Luther King being a major political and religious leader in that movement. And then for students who represented this new militancy and the calls and the rally for black power, they had a spokesperson who articulated this vision of what black power could be, and that was Malcolm X. So these two movements were happening at that time, and for those who were in scholarship, the publication of Washington's book was very important. He presented a thesis that there was a such thing in the United States as a black religion, and this black religion was a quest for freedom and equality. And Washington argued, and not very many people found it controversial, that there was a black religion, but he had a negative assessment, which is to say that black churches had no theology at all, had no liturgy. They were just some quasi-political organizations. So James Cone and others decided, well, we want to refute that thesis, and we want to show that there truly and genuinely is theology in the black churches. And what Cone does in his work, Black Theology and Black Power, is to construct a narrative of the church, that is African American churches. And he says that there are periods of waxing and waning of radicalism, times when the church has been radical and progressive in seeking social justice, and times when it has been complacent. And his thesis was corroborated by one of his colleagues, Gayrod Wilmore, who published a book titled Black Religion and Black Radicalism, to show how this type of protest occurred over several decades within the history of Christianity among black people in the United States. From this discussion on the axis of black religion and black power, it's evident that contemporary black theology is focused on addressing issues around the problem of racial injustice and other forms of oppression experienced by black people. Black theologians' engagement with scholars in other religions will be or has been limited by this preoccupation or concern with just racial justice. I want to describe what I call a polemical model that James Cone constructed. He published another book much later in his career titled Martin, Malcolm, and America, and the subtitle being A Dream or a Nightmare. And in this book, in a very minimal way, he engages Islam, but it's mostly around Malcolm X as a political figure who represents an alternative strategy for dealing with the problem of racial injustice in the United States. Cone portrays King as a representative of the integrationist approach to the problem, and he portrays Malcolm as the representative of the nationalist approach to the problem. And Cone describes these approaches as responses to white racism and the question raised by African Americans' experience of what W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness. And quoting Du Bois, Cone says, "Here then is the dilemma. What after all am I? Am I an American or am I a Negro? Can I be both?" The integrationists answer, yes, you can be both. The nationalists answer and say, no, you're not both. So what Cone does is try to create a synthesis of these two between Martin and Malcolm. And he focuses mostly around qualities and themes in their leadership, and not so much out of their theologies, either coming from Christianity or from Islam. And this takes me to my slide. And as you can see here, this is a summary of how he makes a comparison. In the very center column where you have the green, these are the principal concepts that he's using to show a comparison between Martin on the left and Malcolm on the right. And on the topic of love, he's using some Greek terms to describe how they're approaching this idea of love, this theme of love. The idea of justice, very differently, where King is thinking maybe about distributive justice or spreading and wealth in an equal fashion, whereas Malcolm is thinking about retributive justice, which is some type of response to the long histories of injustice, where there'll be some reciprocity, some repayment against the injustices. Or the idea of hope, very similar, where both are looking at God or Allah as being trustworthy, being morally perfect, and having the power to enable people to do this type of work, providing them with the passion and the motive and the inspiration to do the work. From each religion, he finds an interpretive key where King is on the one hand looking at the cross, the crucifixion of Jesus as representing God's work of redemption. And then Malcolm, who is focusing on the day of judgment, the day when God reckons and brings about reward and punishment. The ultimate goal, on the one hand, for King is the beloved community, and on the other hand, for Malcolm, is the black nation. And the methods that they use or they recommend is King, nonviolent, and Malcolm, black power. I think as someone looks at this summary of the comparison, you would conclude that this is probably not representative of what you truly believe and all that you believe as a Christian or either as a Muslim. So when he does this type of work, he's not engaging all of the religion in its diversity, in its complexity. So I would suggest looking at something else. How do we go beyond just the polemical model, and what do we do? There's some challenges that we have if we move into a different approach. Some of the challenges include what I may title, and because I teach at a university, as a professor, I can create my terms when I want to. So this is a new word. Actually, somebody else did it, and I liked it, and I decided I'm going to use it too. But Supra Confessionalism. That's a big word. But the idea of supra confessionalism is that in any religion, someone makes a confession of faith. The idea of a supra confessionalism is that people, once they come into these dialogues, they begin to make claims that are not rooted within the sacred text and the traditions of the religion itself. What type of things do people say in the dialogues? Sometimes they will make comment around ultimate reality, and that there's an ultimate reality, whereas if you go into the sacred text, it may not say that explicitly. So that means that someone is using a method of interpretation, and they're making decisions about how they're going to interpret the text, where the text does not tell you this is how it is to be explained. So we're making assumptions, and we're saying things in the dialogue that's not coming from the text and the traditions. That represents our own interpretations. So that's a supra confessionalism. That is, we're not just simply confessing what's spoken from the text, we're also bringing our own assumptions to the conversation. That's a challenge for us, because if we're going to have a dialogue and talk about religion, then I have to represent my faith as it is in the sacred text and in the sacred tradition. Otherwise, I'm not being very faithful to my religion. And that poses a great problem. So when we're having these type of discussions, and you're actually with people within a religious community, there's certain things that they're being taught and that they hear every time they gather for worship and for instruction. And the things that they hear and that they're taught when they gather for instruction are not the things that people are confessing and saying in these dialogues. That's a hindrance, that's a problem, that's a challenge for us. So we have to avoid that as one of the landmines. Another challenge for us is the limited and limiting focus on black radicalism. Where there is injustice, it needs to be contested. We need to alleviate and eradicate the sufferings that are in our communities. But that cannot be the only way that we define who we are as black people. There is complexity and diversity in the black experience. And when I woke up this morning, I wasn't thinking about black and white. That was the farthest thing from my mind. I go through many days, and probably you do the same thing as well, where you're not focused around one single problem, the other issues and concerns that you have, the other things that you're trying to address in your own personal life and other people's life. Black people are not a monolith. There's a lot of diversity among black people. And when we come into a dialogue and we don't properly represent how we actually are and who we are, then that becomes a challenge for us in having a dialogue. And we cannot limit our conversations to only one issue. There are many issues that are on the table that we have to address. And also, another challenge of the forces of orthodoxy, it could be lean towards liberalism or literalism or some fundamentalism. And it becomes problematic when these leanings don't allow us to talk about who we are or what we believe. Because we're seeking to be orthodox, we're seeking to be correct in what we believe, to the point where we're overlooking and sometimes minimizing what our experiences are really saying to us. We're not speaking from our experience. We're not speaking from reality as we're living it every day. So what do we do? What do we move beyond the challenges? Well, there's certain things that we can talk about, and let's think about what we can talk about. There's some things that we can talk about. We can talk about truth and reconciliation. Talking about the type of encounters that we have. My heart was made very glad to hear the personal stories and about how there's diversity, religious diversity, even within families, and how families are thriving with this diversity. But sometimes all of the encounters are not positive. And when conversion takes place, sometimes it's not always pleasant within those family contexts. And sometimes there's hurt and there's wounds. And the history of encounter has not always been positive. Sometimes it's been negative. So as we come together for a dialogue, we have to think about truth, being truthful, to say what our encounters have been, positive and negative, as a way towards moving to healing and reconciliation, to heal the wounds. Another topic, which is a myriad of things all together, are the cognates in religion. That is, these are terms and concepts or persons that are spoken of very differently in the religions, but yet there's a basis for us to make some comparisons. As we talk about God, or we talk about prophethood, we talk about righteousness, we talk about important figures like Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. And then there are certain passages in the Quran that are very similar to passages that are in the Christian Bible. And that's a basis for us to have some conversation. The cognates, the similarities there. Another very important topic would be on the message itself, revelation. What is revelation? And what is this revealed truth? We can talk about the origin, the nature, and the destiny of humankind. From where did we come? What is this type of nature that we have as human beings? What are our tendencies that define who we are as human beings? What is our future? What is the future of humanity? And then we can talk about salvation. As we look at the ultimate problems, there's also an ultimate solution. We can also talk about some other things as well. We can talk about conversion. It can be conversion from Christianity to Islam, or from Islam to Christianity, and from either maybe to another religion. And something that's very noticeable about conversion stories that people tell, it's not always around encounter or reading of the text. Sometimes it happens in different ways. It happens maybe that's through the relationships that people develop, maybe certain spiritual experiences that they have. Sometimes there's certain practices that are in one religion that are absent, or maybe that are minimal in another religion. When my sister converted to Buddhism, it didn't surprise me, because I knew that there were certain things that she had experienced in her growing up in a church, a Pentecostal church, that certain religious practices that she never was exposed to until she got older, and something that was missing for her. So in the Pentecostal church, you come to my church, it's loud. It's not quiet. It's not meditative and contemplative. So when she was interacting and encountering other people in Buddhist circles, she found more satisfaction in being able to meditate, being in the still and the quiet. And that was the thing that drew her into Buddhism. So there are a lot of things that draw people into a religion. It's certain practices, certain relationships that people develop. And so as we talk about conversion, it helps to give us better insight into what are the important practices that we should emphasize within our religions. Every religion, if it seeks to be sustainable, has to take an interest in encouraging and welcoming new believers. Otherwise, a religion dies. Everyone has that interest. To be devoted to the religion, you have to be involved in bringing new believers in. So if we're going to bring new believers in, how do we bring them in? What are the things that really help us to sustain the religion that we're a part of? I cannot say that I am fulfilled within a religion and never assume responsibility in this whole part of bringing new believers in. But we need to find out more about what is it that helps people to come and make that step. It's not a hard sell. Sometimes you don't have to sell people really hard on the religion. And then there are times when maybe we need to take a different approach in terms of how we introduce people to the faith and how we engage and encounter them as they decide to make that step. Another topic is contextuality and correlation, the relevance of received religious tradition to the present social realities. So if I'm within a religion, I'm practicing a religion, I have to make it relevant to today. I have to speak to this generation. I've got to look at the context. Things happened 50 years ago. When we watched the film, I remember some of those clips as a little small boy. Some of those things I remember. My brother and my sister, they came of age in the 60s. And I was the little boy that was behind them. And I remember some of the things that they talked about, but just a perspective of a small child looking at the older brother and older sisters. And I remember what their stories were, their pain was, and how they were processing this. And at that time, they were much older. They were teenagers graduating from high school, going off to college. And I remember it from that perspective. But the world today is not the same as it was 50 years ago. Injustice yet exists, but it takes on different forms. We've got to make it relevant. What's our message that we communicate? Can we make it relevant to people today? There are also various myths that are told. Myths and visions of America, what this nation is. And as these myths and these visions are cast about who we are, what the nation is, then our religious tradition has to speak to this context, and we have to make those correlations to show how the message correlates or relates to the realities that people live in today. Another topic is around racial ethnic identity and universal human community. So there's a distinctiveness that we have. We have identities, several identities that make us who and what we are. But we're still human beings. We're part of something that's much larger than our particular racial or ethnic group. We're part of something much larger. And that's an important task that people of faith have to attend. That is, how do we speak specifically to a group of people, but also give them a sense of their tie and connection to other human beings in the world. Another topic is around secularism and the increasing non-religious and non-affiliated. And all religions are facing that, where people are subscribing to various secular ideas and secular philosophies, or choosing not to be a part of any community or any religion at all. And not only are they making the choice not to be affiliated, some are even becoming very hostile towards religion. And that's something that all people of faith encounter. Science and technology are impacting people's lives tremendously. The innovations and discoveries that are changing our world. When my children were very small, we had sitting around the table having a conversation, and my mother-in-law was talking about when she was growing up and they had no television in the house. And the children just thought that was so funny that they had no television. And my wife, she was laughing too. And then my youngest daughter, she says, "Mama, when you were a little girl that they had cell phones?" She said, "No," and they laughed at her. The world is changing tremendously, dramatically. And these type of technologies that are created are affecting human communication and human interaction. There are certain innovations in scientific research that are changing who we are as human beings as well. Genetic engineering is heralded as a way of dealing with sickness and disease, but it's also a technology that could be used to enhance and also select what the next generation of human beings will actually be. So these are the things that we have to discuss. Not only science itself and technology in terms of discoveries and innovations, but also the type of mindset or the scientism that many people operate in within these contexts. And that scientism often is looking at the world from a materialistic and a naturalistic way that has no account for the spiritual dimension of our world. Sexuality and gender has to be a part of our dialogue. What is a sexual orientation? We see several predominantly white Christian denominations are splintering and splitting over the issue of reproductive choice, abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, and same-sex marriage. And black churches and the black mosques cannot evade these issues. This is the context that we're in. This is the world that we live in. We're within this American culture, and we can't evade the issues of sexual orientation, gender equality, and same-sex marriage. And the question of how much diversity can the church or the mosque accommodate in moral perspective? That's where we are. These are just suggestions of some type of things that can be discussed within a dialogue that's not only dealing with the problem of racial injustice, where James Cone and many of his students have decided to focus their black theology, but to broaden this conversation to discuss several other issues. So if we enter into the dialogue, what will we do that will have make sure we have a productive dialogue? Well, these are some emphases that are in the dialogue that we can have. So a dialogue, if it's going to work, we have to have mutual respect, enabling people to feel valued within the dialogue. The dialogue should be around listening and learning. It's a discovery. It's an opportunity to learn, to hear what other people have to say, for us to be able to speak and others listen to us. But we're listening and we're learning from one another in this process. Also, personal story and testimony. A lot of times dialogues break down when we get fixated around doctrine. If you want to see splits and splintering within religions, it usually happens when people are discussing doctrines. It's usually there's breakdown and splits. But where you find people giving their personal story and their testimony, those are things that are irrefutable and that other people have to seriously engage. So in order to drive and move our dialogue forward, then we have to talk about personal story and testimony. Change in belief should be voluntary. The goal is not to convert anybody in the dialogue, but in the course of the conversation, if you hear something and you learn something, if you want to be a morally responsible person when you come into the discovery of the truth, there should be some modification of your beliefs and practices. But whatever it is, it's voluntary. And as we participate in the dialogue, we should be hopeful. If you come into the dialogue and you're very pessimistic, if you look for nothing, you get nothing. But if you believe that this is going to be helpful to you, and you're guided by that, and it becomes a part of your walk of faith, your life of faith, then the dialogue can be meaningful and it can be productive and have many, many good outcomes for you. But these were just some things that I wanted just to put on the table for us to think about and to consider. If you like to, I have the full-length paper with all of the footnotes and everything here, and you can read that at another time. Thank you so much.